Jewish Insights with Justin Pines on JBS is made possible in part by the clubs at Pearl River, New York, luxury rental communities for ages 55 and better, now leasing Phase 3 at the Reserve, and the B.L. Manger Foundation.
הנה מה טוב ומנועים שבת אחים גם יוחד הנה מה טוב ומנועים שבת אחים גם יוחד הנה מה טוב ומנועים שבת אחים גם יוחד הנה מה טוב
Shalom and welcome to Jewish Insights. We're approaching President's Day here in the United States. For a lot of people, that means a day off, or maybe a mattress sale, or maybe even a trip somewhere warm or some skiing. But it's also a moment to pause and ask a deeper question. What is the Jewish soul of the American experiment? When the Founding Fathers looked for a language of liberty, they didn't just look to Greece or Rome. They looked to the Hebrew Bible. They looked to our story. To help us unpack the spiritual DNA of this country and where it's going next, I am super excited to welcome back to the show Rabbi Dr. Ari Lamm. We had an amazing conversation before Thanksgiving, I think 2 years ago now, which continues to be a fan favorite. Michael just told me it's his all-time favorite. If you haven't watched or listened, look it up online. Rabbi Lamm is the CEO of BZ Media. He is the creator of the popular series on Instagram and X, Why Read the Bible in Hebrew. He received his PhD from Princeton University in the history of early Judaism and Christianity, as well as his rabbinic ordination from YU. He is writing his next book on the Hebraic influence of the rise of the West from the Renaissance to the American Civil War. His writings have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Post, Tablet Magazine, the Jerusalem Post, and Sapir Magazine. Ari, I'm so excited that you're back in the studio. I can't wait.
We're back, baby.
All right, here we go. I want to talk about everything. I want to talk about the work you're doing. President's Day is coming. Let's just start with a little bit around, I know we talked about, which I'll never forget, how the first people to arrive in America benched Gomel. They said the special Thanksgiving prayer when they arrived here. Let's move ahead a little bit into history. Talk to me about the Founding Fathers. Tell me some stories. I know you probably could talk for 10 hours about it, but kind of share with me what's on your mind. Share me some Torah to prepare us for President's Day.
So, I actually was just preparing a couple of classes and lectures on the topic, and one of the most fascinating figures that I came across was this gentleman named Ezra Stiles. Ezra Stiles was widely known as the most learned man on this continent, and he was acknowledged as such by Benjamin Franklin. So, if Benjamin Franklin thinks that you're a well-read person, that's pretty impressive.
Yeah.
So, Ezra Stiles, he was the president of Yale University during the American Revolution. He would go on to be the founder of Brown University, so he was like 2 for 7 or whatever it is in the Ivy League. It's a pretty good batting average.
Yeah.
But before all of that, he was a small Congregationalist minister at a parish in Rhode Island. And the reason that's important is because of who he became friends with. And kind of one interesting way to get into that topic is, if you ever read a book about Ezra Stiles or if you ever research him, so there's one very famous portrait of him, and it hangs in the Yale Gallery to this day. It's a portrait of him, in a suit with his hand over his heart and holding a Bible. Thus far, pretty, expected. Next to him, you have an ellipsis, right? Like a little, like vertical, ovalish shape. Mm-hmm. And, if you're a science nerd and you kind of get a sense of when he was living, so he's living in the mid-1700s, you can already start to guess where this is coming from, right? Because the elliptical movement of the planets is actually just being discovered and proven at this time. Cool. Unsurprisingly, that's just to his right. To his left is a bookshelf with a bunch of books on it. The top leftmost book is Newton's Principia, so he's a big fan of Newtonian science, and that's where the ellipsis is coming from. Over his right shoulder is kind of a blue nimbus depicting the cosmos, and in it has in Hebrew letters the name of God, the Tetragrammaton, and so you're already starting to get a sense, okay, he is a Hebraic thinker, He's into Newtonian science. He's pious. He has the Bible. And so then you start to look at his bookshelf and you start to see names of all the most famous New England divines, Cotton Mather, or rather Increase Mather, John Cotton. There are a lot of Cottons and a lot of Mathers. You start to see Thomas Hooker. These are names of like some of the famous, New England religious figures. On the bottom right of the shelf is where it gets really interesting, because there you see the book that has the most titles on it, because it's got a couple of different authors squeezed into one book, but it's meant to represent the whole library behind it. The book says in Hebrew characters, Talmud Bavli, Rashi, Ibn Ezra, and the Rambam.
Wow.
And you start to wonder, who is this guy? Who is this guy who's into the Christian Bible? He's a pious Congregationalist minister. He's a fan of Isaac Newton. He's reading, John Cotton, John Locke. He's friends with Benjamin Franklin. He's corresponding with Jefferson and Adams, who consider themselves like his students in a way, right? He's founding Yale, Brown. He's the master of Yale. And he's got on his shelf in a portrait that he commissioned. He chose every single detail of this portrait we know from his diaries. And he's got Chazal and the Rishonim. He's got the great masters of the rabbinic tradition and the great medieval commentators on his shelf. And he's got, 12 books on the shelf? This is one of the most prominent ones. It's holding pole position aside. Who is this guy? Mm-hmm. If you were to walk outside of his church, walk just a couple of blocks in one direction, you would get to what we now call today the Touro Synagogue. Mm-hmm. And at the Touro Synagogue, a rabbi has just arrived. And we know how excited Ezra Stiles was by this because he writes about his arrival in his diary. A rabbi has just arrived to take over leadership of the congregation. Mm-hmm. Particularly, he's a learned man under any circumstances, but particularly in the New World, to have somebody of this caliber be the rabbi is striking. Usually when you think about, when you'll read histories about the arrival of Torah in America, so that arrival will be dated quite a bit later than this particular figure, but it is extraordinary that someone of this caliber is here. Who is he? His name is Rabbi Rafal Chaim Yitzchak Karagal. Rabbi Karagal is from the city of Hebron, in the Holy Land, from the city of Hebron.
Wow.
And he is a fundraiser, right? So he's one of these things called a shadar. A shadar is one of the emissaries sent out by the community living in the land of Israel at the time, which is deeply impoverished. So they're sending out emissaries across the world to raise money for, it's like the Combined Israel Appeal, to raise money for the Jewish community, to support the Jewish life in the land of Israel. And he's been in England, he's been in the Caribbean, and now he arrives in the New World. And he gets to Rhode Island, and Ezra Stiles is this towering intellectual who, as we talked about last time we were on the show, but I guess I'll recap it a drop, is heir to this, at this point, centuries-long tradition of Christian Europe, and particularly Protestant Europe, being consumed with fascination for the Hebraic tradition of biblical interpretation, of legal interpretation, of mysticism. So you have Ezra Stiles, who's been raised, we know from his diaries, he committed to reading a chapter of the Hebrew Bible in Hebrew every single day with rabbinic commentaries. So you have this guy who's grown up enamored with the rabbinic tradition and completely well-educated and has a background. And all of a sudden, a Jewish rabbi from the city of Hebron, where the patriarchs of Genesis are buried, steps into Rhode Island, and he is overwhelmed with excitement and questions. And we know from his diary, he starts going to his sermons. He goes to there's one particularly memorable time where he goes to hear a sermon that he gives on Shavuot, on Pentecost, and he records the sermon. And I believe at one point he goes on Purim as well. Like it's a whole thing. And they start to get acquainted with each other. Now, I've mentioned Ezra Stiles' diary a couple times now. You can read it. It's called The Literary Diary of Ezra Stiles. He kept an unusually, at least in terms of surviving diaries that have an unusually detailed, like daily diary. And in that diary, he talks about everybody he's met and corresponded with, and his meetings with Rabbi Karagal are no exception. So there'll be times when you look in the diary where he says, oh, I met with Rabbi Karagal and he came to my study. And as I was reading through the diary, I would find that every time he does that, there's like an ellipsis, like a ... And then it'll move on to a different topic. And I'll kind of think to myself, well, hold on, what happened? What did they talk about? I mean, every time he meets with, I don't know, Benjamin Franklin or corresponds with them, we know what they talked about, right? And it occurred to me every time I would look for information in the diary about in the published version of the diary, about his meetings with Rabbi Karagal, it's absent. Now, the original copy...
It's like when the Rebbe turns off the tape in yeshiva?
Yeah, right. It seemed like that to me, right? That's what it seemed like. I was like, what is he hiding?
Turn off the tape.
Yeah.
This is the good stuff.
So I thought to myself, I'm like, are these ellipses in the original manuscript, or is part of this diary missing?
Yeah.
Now, the manuscript is held in the Beinecke Rare Book Room at Yale University. And it's a long and complicated story how I didn't actually even get in there. I had someone else going on my behalf. But I managed to get my hands on WhatsApp photos of the manuscript copy of the diary, and sure enough, pages and pages of it are absent, cut out of the published version of the diary.
Wow!
And all of these pages contain lengthy notes of conversations that they had discussing Torah together.
Are these specifically cut out, or just lots of it cut out in general to make it shorter?
No, I think these specifically are cut out in general.
Someone was like, let's cut out.
So my first thought was like, was it like anti-Semitism? I actually don't think it was that. I just think that if you look at the contents of their conversations, they are so, for like an early 20th century, random American publisher, they're so erudite and so must have seemed like obscure and recondite that they must have just said, like, you know what, whatever, you get the gist. He met a rabbi and blah, 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 blah.
Someone made the call, was like, get rid of the rabbi stuff, it's too complicated.
No one needs to read this stuff,
Fine.
right? It's
Okay.
boring.
All
But
right.
it's amazing
so what do you discover?
to see what they're talking about. They're talking about the Talmud. They're going through passages in the Talmud and discussing it together. Ezra Stiles is asking Rabbi Karagal about passages from the Zohar, the great work of Jewish mysticism, passages from Sefer Yetzirah, the book of creation, another great work of Jewish mysticism, and he's asking him about rabbinic commentaries on the book of Exodus, and Ezra Stiles is an avid collector of, Judaica and biblical antiquities. So he's showing him coins with Aramaic writing on it, and he's trying to, and he says, you speak Aramaic, like, can you read this? And the coins, as it turns out, are in Samaritan Aramaic, right? So Rabbi Karagal can't read them, so he'll say, well, I believe you that it's in an Aramaic dialect, but it's not one that I recognize. They're having these unbelievable conversations. Then, so what comes of this, right? Rabbi Karagal then leaves, and he goes to, I believe, Bermuda or somewhere else in the Caribbean, where he's a great deal more miserable, but much better compensated.
Okay.
But he keeps up this correspondence with Ezra Stiles, with whom he seemed to have formed a really genuine friendship, to the point where they're writing letters back and forth to each other in English and in Hebrew. Ezra Stiles is, at one point he records in his diary, he says, I got a letter from Rabbi Karagal where he referred to me as the great wise teacher who's filled with wisdom, and it's the kind of letter that if you've read rabbinic literature, you kind of recognize the style. Yeah. But Ezra Stiles is like overwhelmed by this because he's a buttoned up, if there ever was a wasp, Ezra Stiles is a wasp, right? He's this this old school, New England trained divine. And he's like, who talks like this? And he asks Rabbi Karagal, and Rabbi Karagal says, it's a mark of my respect for you, and it's how two colleagues who have high regard for each other correspond. And you can see the wheels turning as Ezra Stiles says. He goes, you know what? You're right. And we actually have manuscript copies, which I've also now gotten my hands on, of letters that Ezra Stiles starts writing to Rabbi Karagal in Hebrew, where he addresses him as Ha'aluf, Ha'meromeim, Ha'gaon, Ha'chassid, like it's unbelievable. Admor, like he's calling it like the great, the pious, the righteous, and he's writing to him. I mean, it sounds like the opening to a responsum from a great European sage. And there's one point where he writes a letter to him, and the point of the letter is he's describing for Rabbi Caragol the Battle of Bunker Hill, one of the early salvos in the American Revolution. Sure. And he's telling him about the troop deployments and how his son is enrolled in the military. And Rabbi Caragol writes him back and says, God should keep your son safe. It's amazing news to hear about the colonial victories. And they keep up this amazing correspondence. And now, what do we take away from this? On the one hand, it is abundantly clear that there is to some extent an unbridgeable divide between the two of them. Right? Caragol is a pious, learned rabbinic sage. The funny thing, historiographically speaking, actually, is that there is a lot of scholarship about Rabbi Caragol from historians of early America who don't really know anything about his rabbinic scholarship. There's also not a lot, but some measure of scholarship by Israeli scholars on Rabbi Caragol as a rabbinic writer, and they know almost nothing about his time in America. And it's very funny to read articles in both traditions of scholarship that are completely not aware of the other traditions. But we have like manuscripts of his chuvos that he wrote, of his responsa literature that he wrote. I mean, he's like a serious. He is a neighbor and friend of the Chida, one of the great rabbinic thinkers of the age. They both grew up in Hebron together. So on the one hand, there's this unbridgeable divide. Rabbi Caragol is this towering sage, and Ezra Stiles is a fervently devout Christian minister who speaks openly with Rabbi Caragol about his efforts to prove the Trinity, for example, from the texts of Jewish mysticism. And he's constantly asking Rabbi Caragol, like, hey, here's my theory of the divinity of Jesus based on these 7 rabbinic texts. What do you think? Like, am I on the right track? Yeah. And Rabbi Caragol, for his part, is like, I mean, it's not a threatening letter like you would, Nachmanides would get from an apostate bishop in Barcelona or whatever, right? Like Ezra Stiles is unbelievably friendly. He has tremendous affection for Rabbi Caragol, and the affection is reciprocated. Rabbi Caragol is kind of like bemused by this, but also clearly appreciates the erudition of a fellow scholar, and he engages with him in good faith, and he'll tell him when he's wrong, right? And so on the one hand, there's this unbridgeable gap. On the other, there is this real sense that comes through in all of the letters that Stiles sends to Rabbi Caragol, where he will repeatedly say things like, I look forward to meeting you in the era of salvation. God should keep you and watch over your family and watch over your children, and he should reward you in the world to come. And it's language that seems very incongruous in the mouth of an Orthodox believing Christian Protestant from any century, including the 18th. It sounds the way that a Jewish scholar would talk, particularly one who sees himself in the tradition of Maimonides and the rabbis in believing the idea that in Hebrew, Chasidei umot ha'olam yesh lam chelek la'olam haba, the righteous among the nations of the world inherit a share in the world to come, as the rabbis say, equal to the share that the high priest himself will have. That tradition has clearly seeped into Ezra Stiles' writings. In fact, we know it was explicitly part of his education. We can even trace the European thinkers that he got, and ultimately the Jewish thinkers that Stiles got that from. We know Stiles was aware of that tradition. It clearly has made its way into his vocabulary and his thinking, to the point where he is able to, at the same time, believe that Rabbi Caragol is deeply mistaken about the nature of divinity, as much as Rabbi Caragol thought Ezra Stiles was mistaken. And yet at the same time, he's able to regard Rabbi Caragol as an equal, as somebody worthy of his regard, of his respect, of his affection, and somebody who could and would be, in his mind, an equal participant in the American experiment, which is why he is writing to Rabbi Carregal to tell him about the Battle of Bunker Hill. Rabbi Carregal is no longer in the colonies at this point, and in fact would never return to America. He would die in the Caribbean, I believe in the Caribbean. But Ezra Stiles saw him as a fellow in arms in the fight for American liberty. And that's why he's telling him about this. And to me, that is very much the story of America in a nutshell. And the coda to it is that 2.5 weeks before the Battle of Yorktown, Yale University had gone remote during the American Revolution. And
Everyone was on Zoom?
yeah. There was no pandemic, but there was a war,
Yeah.
right? And so everybody's on Zoom. And so they hadn't had commencement ceremonies for basically, 2.5 years. And finally, Yale has its first commencement exercises since the beginning of the revolution. So it's the first commencement exercises in the history of this country for Yale University. And the president of Yale at the time steps to the podium to deliver the commencement address. The president of Yale is Ezra Stiles, and he delivers the commencement address in Hebrew. And in that address, which is called an oration upon the Hebrew literatures, or the Hebrew or oration upon the Hebrew scriptures, or something like that, he gives a history of Jewish learning from the Bible, from Moses and the prophets, but all the way down to Hillel and Shammai and all the great thinkers of the rabbinic tradition. He talks about Ibn Ezra and Maimonides and the Rambam. And at the end, he says, in Hebrew, he says, in my life, I've had many great teachers, but ki yitaron ha'or al hachoshech, kain yeter al kulam Rabbi Carregal. He says, as light exceedeth the darkness, so doth Rabbi Carregal exceed all of my teachers. He specifically name checks him.
Wow.
And he says, I have not, and then he continues and he uses these, and he's writing in this very unusual Hebrew, because he's kind of like making it up as he goes along,
Yeah.
right? But he says, referring to different Jewish texts, he says, I've not poured water upon the feet of Elijah, nor have I sat at the feet, nor have I, merited to sit at the feet of Rabban Gamliel, one of the great rabbinic thinkers of the Mishnah. But I have a fervent desire. He says, Chemed chamadti. I have this fervent desire that this sort of learning, the learning that I absorbed from Rabbi Carregal, should form the basis of scholarship in all of the colleges and universities of America. He wrote an English translation of this speech. And the word that he uses in the Hebrew, the phrase that he uses in the Hebrew for colleges and universities of America is Batei Midrash Shel America, the study houses of America, the base mentors of America. He says, and I believe that this should form the basis of all higher learning in all institutions of learning throughout the West. And sure enough, Rabbi Carregal becomes immortalized in the history of Yale University. To this day, if you walk into the Yale Gallery, you will see a massive portrait of a rabbi dressed in sumptuous red robes and wearing this like tall, conical kind of fur hat. And he's a Hebron-derived rabbi. It's a picture of Rabbi. It's a portrait of Rabbi Carregal that Ezra Stiles had commissioned and hung in the Yale Gallery.
Wow.
And so as we think about President's Day,
Yeah.
and as we think about the role that we as a people can have and should and will play in this republic, I think it bears recalling that at the very, very outset of the American experiment, Jewish ideas, and not just Jewish ideas in the sense of, the Hebrew Bible is a Jewish text ultimately, which it is, but rabbinic ideas, like deeply and you might even say esoterically rabbinic ideas drawn from the Mishnah, the Talmud, the mystical tradition, the medieval commentators, the philosophical tradition, played a formative role upon some of the greatest thinkers and architects of the American Republic, from our greatest politicians and statesmen to our greatest stewards of higher education. And it's not an accident, I think, that America and American learning has flourished in the way that it has, because it, more than any other tradition in the history of the West, has been open and eager imbibers of Jewish intellectual wisdom and Jewish thinkers. And it seems to me that's something deeply worth celebrating.
Wow. All right. I have lots of questions. Yeah. That was an amazing story. Thank you for sharing. Fascinating. So when you say that, so you're saying that, I was thinking about the way Jewish thinking influenced how we think about the Constitution and liberty, those kinds of things. But you're saying also the way we think about education is influenced by Judaism heavily.
Yeah. I mean, and by the way, it extends to the Constitution as well. What's one fascinating, episode in history is, Benjamin Franklin is well known as one of the contributing drafters to the United States Constitution. I think most Americans will also be familiar with the fact that whether or not to adopt the Constitution as the law of the land was deeply controversial. And, two camps kind of sprung up around it. There were the Federalists who were in favor of ratification and the Anti-Federalists who were against. Benjamin Franklin wrote one public letter in defense of constitutional ratification. He published it anonymously, but everybody knew it was him. He published it under the name K. I don't know why. In a newspaper in Philadelphia. And in that letter, Benjamin Franklin argues in favor of constitutional adoption on the basis of one source. He quotes only one source of antiquity in that entire letter, and it is the Babylonian Talmud. And he says the letter is about the story of Korah, who's the great kind of arch villain of the Book of Numbers. He's the biblical figure who rebels against Moses and Aaron and seeks to take control over the Israelites for himself and his cronies, and in a way, Korah is kind of like he's a populist figure in the sense that his argument on its face is, aren't all of us, aren't all the children of Israel holy? Mm-hmm. Why are you lording it over us? But what he's really accusing Moses and Aaron of is corruption, right? He's saying you've taken, he's implying that, Moses has somehow engineered his way into leadership over this people illicitly and against God's will. So Franklin refers to that story, and he says, there are details about this story that are related to us in the Talmud that you won't find in the Bible. And he says, I think that these details are essential for us today. Why did he think they were essential? A little bit of background. What was the key point of disagreement between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists? The answer is executive power. There are other disagreements as well, but that was one of the most important ones. The core argument that the Anti-Federalists made was, we just fought a rebellion against the king. And in fact, the argument that we made against the king was a Hebraic argument, right? We said that kings are idols. How did they know? How did they get the idea that kings were idols? I mean, Europeans had had kings for centuries upon centuries. Where would they get the idea that kings were idolatrous? Well, the answer is they got it from the Talmud. And they got it in particular from Midrashic literature. So the genesis of this is John Milton of Paradise Lost fame, so he's famous for writing Paradise Lost, but he was at the time and should be today, I think more or just as justly remembered for being one of the great advocates for Republican government. He was anti-monarchical, and you can imagine that he kind of had to defend that position from other great thinkers in the European milieu at the time. And in arguing for not only the legitimacy of Republican government, government by the people, but actually for the exclusive goodness of Republican government. In other words, republicanism to the exclusion of other types of government. Milton drew upon rabbinic literature. And in fact, he quotes at length a text from Deuteronomy Rabbah, which is one of the early rabbinic commentaries upon the book of Deuteronomy. And in that commentary, the rabbis say, they're quoting a verse from Jeremiah, and they quote God as saying, my children, like the Israelites, my children, in Hebrew, Kach hashavti shetiyeh cheres min hamalchios. I always intended that you should be free of kingship, but you desired otherwise. And he compares them to a wild donkey who snuffs up air, which is the verse from Jeremiah. And the rabbis say that God said, you were like a greedy donkey who was gulping down the empty breath of kingship. And so, because you asked for a king, I'm going to punish you. And what's your punishment? You're going to get exactly what you asked for, because having a king is terrible. And then Rabbi Joshua, the son of Levi, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, then says, commenting upon that statement, he says, those who trust in God will merit to be like God, merit to be godly themselves. He says, "Aval kol haboteach ba'avoda zara," but anybody who trusts in idol worship, and he's referring in that line to monarchy, because anyone who trusts in idol worship, nischayev lios kamoso, will suffer the same fate as an idol, right? Now, Milton picks up on this passage, which he had found in other great Hebraic scholars of the day, Christian Hebraic scholars of the day. He says, well, if you take that view seriously, then clearly monarchy is a form of idolatry, and in fact was only given to the Israelites to punish them. Now, they made the best of it, that's certainly true, but that's true of any punishment of God, you should make the best of it. But the original Hebrew republic that God imagined was a republic, right? And so Milton says, and I quote, I follow the opinion of these rabbis. Now, that argument goes out of favor, very much out of favor in England after Milton's time. Why? Because as you know, England has this succession of Catholic and Protestant monarchs. So, and these are names that people will know. So after Henry VIII, who inaugurates the English Reformation, so then then there's a succession of there. Well, there's a short-lived reign by Edward VI, which goes nowhere, mostly because he dies young, and then he's succeeded by Queen Mary, Mary I, who is Henry VIII's daughter by Catherine of Aragon. Now, Catherine of Aragon is the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spanish Inquisition infamy. So you can well imagine that Mary I is a good Catholic. And she is now known to history as Bloody Mary because of the repression that she exercises against Protestants in the realm. She then dies, I believe of cancer, and had she not, England, might have re-Catholicized. But in the event, she dies, and she is succeeded by Elizabeth I, who is Henry VIII's daughter by Anne Boleyn. And Elizabeth kind of sets England firmly at a Protestant footing, and then, but she's famously the Virgin Queen, so who is going to succeed her? And eventually England kind of has, King James, and then this, and James II, and eventually England ends up in a place where it's become a very heavily Protestant country, but James II is now ascending to the throne, who is a serious Catholic. And England was like, that's it. We're not having this. We're actually not going to make him king. We're going to invite William and Mary, William of Orange from the Netherlands, and his wife, the English Mary. We're going to invite them over to take over England. And this is known in English history and wider constitutional history as the Glorious Revolution. It's called the Glorious Revolution because it basically goes off without a shot. So England has this England overnight becomes what's called a constitutional monarchy, where you have a monarch and they're still accorded all the honor and respect of being monarchs, but policy is set by Parliament. And as far as most Republican thinkers go, they're like, take the W, right? Like, okay, we still have a king and whatever, but like, Milton is out there like, but we still have idols in the temple. We still have monarchs, right? No one's in the mood for that. We've just successfully gotten our constitutional monarchy. No one's interested. That argument goes away. And it basically fades into obscurity, except it is taken across the ocean by a young, ne'er-do-well, failed farmer who in so many respects is just this uncouth, as it turns out, atheistic provocateur whose really only talent lies in what today we would call short-form content. So he's like one of the greatest Twitter posters of all time, this guy. And he writes a pamphlet in which he launches a sustained, principled, brutal attack against the institution of monarchy. And in that pamphlet, he quotes at length, almost verbatim, the arguments that John Milton makes about how kings, monarchs, are idols that should be torn down and are unsuitable to govern any country whatsoever, and certainly should not be seen as suitable to govern these American colonies. That pamphlet is called Common Sense. The author is Thomas Paine. This is the pamphlet that launches the American Revolution. And the argument that launches the American Revolution is that argument that Milton made about monarchs being idols that should be torn down, the opinion that he explicitly attributed to these rabbis that I follow, right? The degree to which Thomas Paine had almost plagiarized Milton was so obvious that John Adams, who would become the second president of the United States, speaking of President's Day, who hated Paine because he thought he was like a jumped up commoner, right? Sure. So Adams records in his diary, he says, I confronted Mr. Paine and I said, you took all of your arguments right from Milton, there's no originality here. And he says, Paine like gleefully admitted that of course I did, they're pretty good arguments, why wouldn't I take them, right? So it is the rabbis who launched the American Revolution. So now, put yourself back in the argument over constitutional ratification. What's the main argument that the Federalists are making? It's a rabbinic argument, and it's a Hebraic argument, and they are explicit about this. They're writing, we just fought a whole revolution to tear down a king, and we did it because our understanding of the book of Samuel's rejection of monarchy and the biblical strictures against and the biblical suspicion of monarchy and all the biblical tales of monarchical bad behavior, we rejected a king specifically because of that Hebraic heritage that we all hold in common. And now you're coming and telling us that the Articles of Confederation were no good, so we have to have a strong central executive? You're telling me we have to have a reinstalled king? You're violating the Hebraic terms of the revolution we just fought. So along comes Benjamin Franklin, and he says, I have to somehow diffuse this argument. And now Franklin's quotation of the Talmud makes perfect sense because remember, the argument that he needs to counter is a Hebraic argument. The only way to counter it is with a Hebraic argument of your own. Mm-hmm. And so Franklin says, you guys, the anti-federalists, you're not Moses rebelling against a tyrannical Pharaoh. You're Korah rebelling against a legitimate government led by Moses and Aaron. And he says, you know what the Talmud says about Korah? It was actually his ambition to tear down Moses because he wanted what Moses had. And his wife actually speaks to Korah and advises him. And he says, look, Moses has appointed himself in charge of the government. His brother's the high priest. His nephews are going to be his successors, and his cousins are going to be getting, all the matnos kahuna, all the priestly gifts and the gifts given to the Levites, right? And he said, and Korah reasons, if I can somehow topple the Mosaic government, I can kind of slip into the leadership myself. And so Franklin says, you're a Korahite demagogue, all of you anti-federalists. We're not erecting a king, we're electing a governor. Moses is Moses is our captain, right? And he's not our king, he's our captain. And the notion that you can have a republic that has an executive without being an idolatrous monarch, that is a deeply Hebraic notion. It's drawn directly from the Talmud by Benjamin Franklin. And in fact, that article, that essay that Franklin writes, is so influential that it's printed and reprinted numerous times on both sides of the Atlantic. And as soon as he writes it, and he writes it with ratification by the final two states in mind, and sure enough, basically just a couple of weeks or like a month and a half after he writes it, New Hampshire would finally ratify the Constitution, and thereby giving just enough states to make the Constitution the law of the land. And Franklin's letter is really one of the things that tips the scale, and it's an argument straight from the Talmud.
Yeah.
So the constitutional history of this country is, in its deepest, most foundational elements, a rabbinic one.
Beautiful. We could go for hours here. This is beautiful. I want to ask you, kind of try to bring us from that era to the era we are today. You know, when did we stop having non-Jews or Jews having Gemaras on their shelves in the same way? and how does that lead into the work that you're doing right now?
Sure. So the scholarly Hebraicism that I've described was really only ever a province of like the elite, but the kind of folk Hebraism, right? All of the trickle down effects of that, you know, like people like Ezra Stiles or John Milton or John Selden, some of these great, you know, English thinkers and American thinkers as well, who are learning Hebrew, reading in Hebrew, reading rabbinic literature. So they're in the minority technically, but all of that filters down to the point where, and it lasts a lot longer than you would imagine. I would argue, in fact, it still exists to this day, and that's a very important lesson for us in the Jewish community. Just to give an example, Harriet Beecher Stowe, who writes probably the most consequential novel in American history, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which helps launch the Civil War, writes another novel called Old Town Folks. It's a wonderful portrait of life in New England. It's a beautiful story. In that book, she has this scene where the narrator is recalling a grandfather at prayer in New England. And the way the book describes this narrator, the way Harriet Beecher Stowe describes the grandfather, who would have been and she's describing in a way that it's meant to be a familiar scene to Americans across the country. She says he prayed like a Hebrew in Canaan, and all of these, and she says, like, if and she has some line which I don't remember verbatim, but it's something like, if he had been speaking Hebrew, it wouldn't have been out of place, right? So you have this real Hebraism at the heart of the American experiment. It persists. I mean, it undergirds the founding era. It helps launch the Civil War. I mean, all you have to do is read any of the great orations from Abraham Lincoln, speaking of President's Day, Frederick Douglass. They're essentially Hebrew prophetic encomia. They're drawing deeply and explicitly from the Hebrew prophets. You then go past the Civil War into the Reconstruction era, and you get to the presidency, I think the much misunderstood and understandably but mistakenly maligned presidency of Ulysses S. Grant. I actually think he's one of the most underrated American presidents. Grant, for example, is responsible for breaking the back of the Ku Klux Klan in its first and in many ways most dangerous iteration. But Grant, after he leaves office, becomes the first the first American president, sitting or former, to ever visit the Holy Land. Lincoln himself, before he dies, is reported by his wife to have said, to his wife, that just before he's shot, I wish I could visit Jerusalem. Fast forward past Reconstruction to civil rights, Martin Luther King Jr.'s entire career is shot through with Hebraic imagery. The final speech that he gives is I've been to the mountaintop, I've seen the promised land, and we may not get there together, but you'll take the banner from me. One of his chief lieutenants who accompanies him throughout the civil rights journey testifies that not a day went by on the civil rights journey where we weren't speaking about Moses. Not a day went by. Think about Reagan framing the Cold War as a biblical conflict. I mean, he's drawing throughout his presidency on biblical themes. I mean, the truth is, of the speeches that President Obama gives as recently as how 2 presidencies ago, right? I think the best speech he ever gave is the Joshua generation. It's a speech when he's running for president where he says, it's basically a drasha. It's like a sermon, right? Where he says, we are the generation that established our society has passed, and we're the ones who kind of have to take up the mantle and cross the river together. It's a great speech. Hebraic themes are an inextricable part of the American story to this day. Now, there is a sense, I think, in the Jewish community certainly, and I think it's more broadly shared, that none of this could be true because of how rapidly and decisively America has secularized. And there is some truth to that. I mean, secularism was and remains to this day an important, I think, threatening and malign force in American life. But nevertheless, I think people are just missing what's happening right now. So what's happening now?
Is it because Jews are living in the cities that are liberal and secular, and all the Christians they don't see because they're not there? Is that what? But anyway, you go. Sorry, what's happening right now?
It could be.
Yeah.
I mean, but the truth is, a lot of what I'm about to describe is happening in cities also.
Okay, fine, go for it.
We just live in a bubble, right? We Jewish communities like to think of themselves as very cosmopolitan, and we are. Except I think, and I think that's probably why we miss a lot of this, because the group of people who think of themselves as very cosmopolitan are in fact very provincial, and we are, along with all of our fellow cosmopolitans, in a basically cosmopolitan ghetto.
Yeah.
And so we miss what's happening. If you ask your average person in the Jewish community, what's the most significant thing that has happened on campuses in the last 2.5 years, I think without a doubt any Jew would say encampments, right? Anti-Israel, in many cases pro-Hamas, Gaza encampments. And I think if you ask your average American student, your average American kid, they wouldn't say encampments. Most of them would have, the vast majority of them would have no idea what that is. They would say revivals. So you go to any of these campuses and you'll see Christian revivals springing up on campus after campus. I mean, last year's national championship in college football was the second most watched sporting event in the United States after the Super Bowl. Notre Dame versus Ohio State, 2 storied programs. Both teams are, have 40-man rosters where every single person on each roster is in a weekly team Bible study. And in pregame interviews, all they're talking about is the Bible, what they're learning in Bible study. Oh, you want to talk to me about game film? Let me tell you about what I'm reading in Proverbs, right? They're each saying about each other, if I have to lose this game, I'm glad I'm losing to a bunch of godly guys on the other team. Now, last year, Ohio State wins that game, wins the national championship. Go Ohio State. That summer, there is a revival at Ohio State's campus. And it ends, and they're singing, and it's basically a Christian kumsitz, right? And it ends with hundreds of kids getting baptized in a fountain on the quad. Now, had that happened in the 90s or the 80s, it would have been Campus Crusade, lovely people, but culturally marginal. The people leading all of this on Ohio State's campus was the national title winning football team. They were the ones baptizing people on the campus.
Wow.
They were the ones making content about this. They were the ones leading the charge. And if you think to yourself, who are the major cultural figures in pop culture today? Once upon a time, I guess we can date ourselves here a little bit, right? So when we're growing up, what are we listening to? Or at least what am I listening to? I don't want to shame you by association. But what am I listening to? Well, Compton is a capital of hip hop, so Dr. Dre, Tupac, Ice Cube, the whole NWA crew, Easy, right? Outside of hip hop, what's big in music? the Backstreet Boys, Britney Spears, who's big in sports, Jordan, Barkley, Mia Hamm, right? That's a good little 90s cut for you, right? So what do all of those figures have in common? Who knows, right? Like, you could tell me every single person I just mentioned was Christian. None of us would know. It wasn't part of their public persona, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't a part of their brand. Fast forward, blah, 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 blah years to today, right? Compton's still the capital of hip hop. Who's the biggest hip hop artist in Compton? I mean, he played the Super Bowl last year. It's Kendrick Lamar. There's Big Sean. Outside of Compton, there's Chance the Rapper. Outside of hip hop, there's Bieber. There's Carrie Underwood. There's Tori Kelly. There's Jelly Roll. Outside of music and sports, there's Steph Curry. There's Caitlin Clark. And that's not even to mention any of the gajillions of Instagram, YouTube, TikTok influencers that won't be household names probably for our listeners right now. But these are people with millions of followers. Eli Ellis, Isaac Ellis, Sia Cloud, Noah Schnacky, Austin Armstrong. Like, these are huge names. Jack Griffo, star of one of the most popular TV shows on Netflix for kids, The Thundermans. What do all of these people I just mentioned have in common? Not only is every single one of them a Christian, but every single one of them has Christianity as an integral part of their public persona. You take every major athlete at the pro level, the college level, NFL, NBA, NCAA, or overtime elite, like these fast-growing prep leagues with huge Instagram and TikTok presences. Take every single one of those major people. You line them up on the wall over here. You throw a dart. 97 times out of 100, you're going to hit somebody where if you look in their Instagram bio or their TikTok bio, you will see a Bible verse there. What's happening in the United States right now is, according to Springtide research, 77% of young people say they're searching for spirituality, whatever the heck that means. 66% say that they are religious. According to the best surveys we have, 53% of Gen Z says that they're Christian. What does that mean? Hard to know. We also know that the rise of nones, N-O-N-E-S, right, people of no declared religious affiliation, which was a much ballyhooed indicator of rising secularism in the United States because that number was going up and up and up and up. In the last 2 years, it has now stalled out, and there's some signs that it's actually now slowly decreasing. Meanwhile, Gen Z, they're not, by the best data we have, they're not going to church. They are not developing relationships with local pastors, but we do know that they're getting a ton of content. And by the way, they're not even necessarily going to digital church services, but they are getting a ton of Christian content from Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, Snapchat, Twitter, X, you name it, Twitch, you name it. And it is becoming, and pop culture is becoming just dominated by a sense of faith, of Christianity. Now, it's not evangelical. In 1990, let's say, 1 out of every 3 American Protestants would have called themselves evangelical. Today, based on research that we've done, and we've now done multiple studies on this, that number is under 8%. There's been a collapse of denominational life. A historic collapse of denominational life. And this has been documented in many other studies as well. There is no denomination other than the Assemblies of God, and that's for a specific reason, that's growing in the United States right now. And yet this non-denominational, young American Christianity and when I say non-denominational, that's not code for tepid. These are people who are hungry, who are excited, who are reading their Bible and curious about it, is exploding, and it's culturally central. These are people who, if I'm thinking about this from, let's say a land of Israel perspective, know absolutely nothing about Israel. Every survey we have of Gen Z tells us that Gen Z does not care about Israel, the Middle East, Gaza, Palestine, Hamas. They're not interested. They don't know anything about it. They don't read about it. They're not interested in reading about it. They don't watch cable news, so they're not seeing all the headlines you're seeing. They do not read newspapers, so they're not seeing all the newspaper headlines that you're seeing. And they're getting all of their content from Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube, which are algorithmic, which means if they're not interested, if you're interested in the Middle East, your feed is going to be a dumpster fire of anti-Israel stuff. But if you're not seeing anything. You're not seeing anything pro, you're not seeing anything against. Now, that means you're going to have an entire generation right now that is completely apathetic to to any sort of connection to the land of Israel. And what that will mean is that the U.S.-Israel relationship, if that's what you're interested in, right, will die by a million cuts because that relationship has never been sustained by tolerance or by neutrality. It's been sustained by enthusiasm. That's what we've been talking about. I mean, the deep Hebraic roots of this country. No wonder America has had this historic affinity for the land and people and destiny of Israel. That will all go away if nothing is done. At the same time, you have this rising generation of people who are hungry for meaning, for faith, for authentication of the things that they believe, for a sense of reality around the Bible that they read every morning. Most people who are interested in talking to people about Israel think about the challenge in front of them as follows. What questions do you have about Israel, that I can answer? I believe that the best thing for Israel, the Jewish community, for America and American history and the vitality of American life, for American Christianity, and for Western civilization as a whole, the best thing for all of those things is for a young generation to begin to think to itself, not because they're being asked to do this, empathetically or because of a Super Bowl ad or because of whatever. You're going to have a whole young generation of people that are going to rise up and they are going to think, what are the biggest questions that I have in my life, period? Not about Israel, about anything. Friendship, parenthood, faith, family. And then how can we show them that Israel, the land of Israel, the people of Israel, the destiny of Israel, the scripture and wisdom and literature of Israel is the answer to their biggest questions. Mm-hmm. That's the opportunity in front of us. You have a whole generation of people who are central to culture, who are hungry for faith, who are non-denominational. So they are detached from all of the structures of meaning that would have dominated their lives 2, 3, 4, 5 decades ago. And this generation is ripe for revival, for inspiration, for a new great awakening. And it begins with showing people like this. I think a good way to do it is, by using people of influence, so major content creators. You show them the land of Israel. I've had the opportunity to do this. I'll take, major young American Christian content creators. We'll take them to Israel. Now, they've never been. They don't know anything about the place. Most of them have never met a Jewish person in their life. Why would they? I mean, they're basically none of us. And as you said, we all live in enclaves, mm-hmm. right? They know nothing about the politics, modern politics or ancient, like literally nothing. Whatever you think they know, they mm-hmm. don't. Mm-hmm. The long ingrained instinct of our community is that when someone like that is willing to come to Israel, where do you take them? Yad Vashem. You take them now to Kibbutz Be'eri. You give them a security briefing from a general. You take them to Latrun, all that kind of stuff. You don't do any of that. What do? You take somebody to the Mount of Olives, to the city of David, to the city of Hebron, home of Rabbi Karagal, and more importantly of the biblical patriarchs and matriarchs. You take them to the Sea of Galilee. You take them to the Valley of Elah, where David fought Goliath. You take them to the Western Wall. You take them to the ruins of the old Jerusalem that one day will be restored. And what you show them is, if you're looking for hope, you find it here. How do I know? Well, we all believe in a God who keeps his promises. The biggest promise God ever made is to restore the people of Israel to the land of Israel. So when I'm home, in front of my computer, in front of my phone, or I wake up in the morning, and I have that little bit of anxiety in the back of my head that kind of bites at me and says, how do I know that God is going to keep his promises to me in my own life? I can look out the window and I can see God is in the process of keeping the most gargantuan promise he ever made. And when I walk the streets of Jerusalem and I see the words of Zechariah 8 of young boys and girls playing in the streets of Jerusalem coming to life before my very eyes, I know, not I think, I know that God keeps his promises. and so I know that he'll keep his promises to me. That is a recipe for a friendship between the people of Israel, the land of Israel, and the great and wonderful people of this amazing country, that is not rooted in sympathy, in victimhood, in sadness, in cajoling or berating or bullying around this or that political issue. It's not rooted in demagoguery. It's rooted in shared values, a shared belief in the moral, intellectual, and spiritual engine that has powered the West through to this very day. And I think that's the opportunity we have in front of us.
Amazing. I have follow-up questions, but only I'll get to ask them because we're out of time. Ari Lamm, what a treat as always. I feel so inspired, opening up my eyes both about our history and about our future. I'm wishing everyone a happy President's Day. And Ari, thank you.
Let's go.
All right.
הנה מה טוב ומה נעים שבת